everybody, welcome to number 27. I'm Jack, and this is a really early DeTomaso's Pantera. I did a video a few weeks ago on one of the later cars, 1988, a GT5. And I was told that I absolutely had to try one of the earlier cars because they are very, very different in nature. On top of which, I was really interested in trying one of these because they ran concurrently to the 308, and I really want to find out once and for all, at least in my mind, if this was a genuine alternative and a competitor for the small Ferrari of the 70s, or whether it was just a little upstart. Crucial for the purpose of this test is to discuss the price difference between this and the 308. So when launched, the Pantera was just $10,000, super cheap. The GTS version, a few years later, in 1975, was $15,000. The 308, when it was launched, was $28,000, so significantly more expensive. And in terms of performance, I can say that this was definitely well ahead of the Ferrari. As standard, it came with 330, the GTS had 350 versus the Ferrari's 250 horsepower. Granted, that Ferrari, especially the first one, the Vetro was a lot lighter than this. At 1,050 kilos, this was 1,400. However, by the time the 308 was steel bodied 2 years after that, that weighed 1,200 kilos, still 200 kilos lighter than this, but the difference is narrowing. And this has such a strong performance advantage. It's not just the horsepower figures that I told you about, but this develops peak horsepower at 5,600 revs, the Ferrari 7,700. And the Ferrari has 205 pounds of torque as opposed to 325. So you're starting to get the idea here. Before we take it out and I tell you some more detail on how it drives and how it compares to the Ferrari, let's have a quick look around, because this might not be as pretty as a 308, but there's something about the looks and also the rarity which makes it exotic in quite a different way. So at the front here, it seems very slightly unbalanced, I think, and you can see that from the side as well. The nose is just a little bit, I don't know, it's all back end, and the nose is quite delicate, so there's a bit of an imbalance there. It's not bad, it doesn't look bad. Although this has some smaller tyres than the GT5 I tried, they are still pretty beefy. So 225 60s at the front and 285 60s at the back. Now let me just show you the back end, because this is where I think, this is for me anyway, the best angle of this car, is this. I mean, it just looks, with those exhausts sort of popping out there, from here you can just see the top of the filter of that engine. We'll have a look at the engine in a minute. It's a really aggressive, menacing looking car. As I said, not as pretty as a 308 perhaps, but it has its own look. Like the Mangusta that came before it, it's all rear haunches. It's just all business, isn't it? Right. And just check this out. So normally, ordinarily, there is a cover there. So you have a little bit of a boot, a warm boot, of course. This engine has been uprated to GTS spec, so it will be putting out about 350 horsepower instead of 330. It's just being rebuilt, so I have to take care with it. The beauty about these cars is that because they have these American mechanical components, they are really quite cheap to upgrade compared to the Ferrari anyway. And also, upgrades don't hurt their values in the same way that it would if you started hot rodding or messing with a 308. There is, and they came like this, no window. So the engine is just out in the elements. There is a window, of course, between the cabin and this. And you can just see there, the back of the driver's seat has carbon fibre, and that is because that is a much thinner seat that has been put in by the current owner, who's 6'4" and had no chance of fitting in the car. I'm not going to tell you a whole history of DeTomaso's himself, because I did that in the last video, but I think it's worth just telling you one quick anecdote before we talk about the car, and that is when he arrived in Modena from Argentina, he asked which the best hotel was in Modena, which was the Canal Grande. He therefore decided to stay there, even though he didn't have the money to pay for his stay. So after a month, they threw him out. When they threw him out, he said, I'm going to buy this hotel one day. And he actually did. That's the kind of man that he was. Now, ventilation, much like 308s, to be honest, isn't this car's strong point. So I've just had to open the window. But that's even better, really, because you can hear that engine. So technically, there are some differences between the two. They both use double wishbone suspension with dampers and coil springs. But the Pantera was more advanced really than the 308 because it used a monocoque, whereas the 308 has a steel sort of trellis, steel tube chassis. The engines are both V8, but very, very different. The Ferrari 3-litre V8 is a flat plane crank and is a revvy little monster. You have to rev it to get the best out of it. Whereas the Ford-sourced Cleveland 5.8 litre V8 is really quite a lot about the torque. Now, in terms of the cabin, I fit quite well in this, but it's purely because I have this sort of very thin seat, which has given me more headroom and more legroom. Ordinarily, the 308 is also a bit challenging for taller people, but there's definitely much more room in the interior than the DeTomaso's, which feels a little bit more claustrophobic. The view out of the side as well is really, the rear three quarters on this is really difficult. But in terms of usability, the gearbox is delightfully easy to use. The only thing it has is it's not got a huge amount of self-centering. So when you go down from fourth to third, sometimes you have to know where to point it to get it into the right gear. I think this is the bit we've all been waiting for, and it's a pull up the road if there's no cars coming, and there aren't. Now it's a bit greasy today, so I've got to be a bit careful. This engine has been tickled, and I think that the owner, Mark, said that it still needs just a tiny bit of fettling low down. It's a little bit lumpy between 1,000 and 1,500 revs, which would tally with what he says, but it is an extremely strong, really lovely engine. No point in revving it. I know the red line is sort of about 5.7, but really between 4 and 5 is where you want to be with this. Instrumentation isn't super logical, but it's not too bad. You can reach it all quite easily. Instruments, at least you can read quite clearly, unlike the GT5 where I couldn't see the rev counter. You can drive this on the torque, and at parking speeds the steering is heavy, but once you get going it is a delight. This doesn't have the original wheel and tyres, which I can't remember what they were, 205s at the front and I think 225s or something like that at the back. It's got wider tyres, but they are narrower than the GT5, and it does give it a little bit more delicacy and a bit more, and it's a bit more agility as well, I think. Now the brakes on this are really quite good, and that's because they're not standard Pantera brakes, they're Willwood brakes, so they've been upgraded, so lots of stopping power, lots of feel, very different to the standard car. But compared to a 308, it's a bit more of a brutish car. Now the thing with 308s is they don't reward hard, quick impulses. You have to be quite delicate with them. This, in that way, is more forgiving. As well, with all that torque that engine has, you can kind of concentrate on what you're doing instead of having to think about being in the right revs, right gear at the same time. The Ferrari gearbox is also, although more rewarding maybe in some ways, it is a harder gearbox to use. This is simple. I mean, apart from making sure that you're kind of hitting the right gears on the way back down, because of that self-centering, it's light, it's easy, it's positive. So that is absolutely great. Now, performance-wise, I would say, I've heard people say 308s are faster if you look up on Google and some of the forums, but there's absolutely no way. I know this one's pepped up with 350, but all the same, this is definitely faster than a 308. Perhaps some of the really detuned Panteras, so they started off in the States with 330, but as the years went on, emissions legislation strangled the output, I think, eventually to about 230 horsepower. So perhaps those are a bit slower than the original 308s, especially the fiberglass ones, which were lighter, but ordinarily this is on a completely different league in terms of performance and usable performance. With the 308, you want to carry a bit more corner speed. You use the precision of the car to place yourself on the road. This doesn't have that, so it's more like aim as close as the apex as you can, then put your foot down and just squirt away. Now it's at this point that I start to think, Jack, you're a bit of an idiot. Why did you even set out to make a comparison between the two? Because they are such different cars. 200 kilos in weight between them. There's almost 100 horsepower in difference. The Ferrari's actually much more expensive. But the thing is that, you know, through the years, as we've grown up with these cars, this was really supposed to be an alternative to a Ferrari. And in some ways, I think it is actually much better. It's definitely easier to drive, I think easier to maintain, cheaper to modify if you wanted to do that. And also it has a different exotic factor to the 308, because the 308 is prettier, but this is, I don't know, it's got something about it. This DeTomaso's all have something about them. I think maybe it's the rarity, the fact it's not as well known as Ferrari, but it's you know, it's appealing in an entirely different way. Now, something that's really interesting is that at the time these may have been much cheaper than 308s, but today that is really completely reversed, especially with the later models, which were much rarer. So these sort of narrow bodies were built in greater numbers because Ford had partnered up with DeTomaso at the time, and they sold through, I think, the Mercury dealerships. So in the first 3 or 4 years, I think they sold 5,000 of them. After that, only another 2,000 in total. Oh, I love these. I love these. I love Panteras. I love the late ones. I love the early ones. You know, I was expecting it to feel totally alien compared to the GT5, whereas you can definitely feel the lineage. Perhaps if I'd had one with the original tyre sizes, it would be more marked. Either way, they're brilliant cars. But let me get back to the pricing that I was talking about. Nowadays, the late cars, GT5s and so on, the wide body cars, they actually go for quite a lot of money. The one I drove last time is valued at 150. The narrow body cars, a bit less so, although values again are all over the place. But this very car is for sale. Mark is selling it. I think depending on when the video is released, I think it'll probably be with historics. In any case, if you're interested, I'll put a link in the video description. But obviously it's a car that's completely restored. You can see how it's in great condition. And it has had a few sympathetic mods to the GTS style, but in terms of values, even these sort of narrow body cars are at the top end of what 308s are worth. So if you exclude the vetro resinas, which are much more money, the DeTomaso's may have been almost half the price, but they are now more expensive than the Ferrari. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you to Mark for letting me have the car for 3 days. It's been nice to have something for a while actually, rather than just driving it and having it for an hour or so to do videos. So thank you very much, Mark. If you're interested in buying it, get in touch with him. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you have an interesting car that you want me to review, then Instagram is the best way. Thank you so much for watching, and see you for the next video.